Rubbish. Waste. All words that can accurately describe Warner Bros. Yes, I've thrown many tomatoes at them, I know, but they just keep making it so easy. They're a spitball magnet. And it can really, a large part of it, be traced back to one decision, a patient zero, David Zaslav. Since he took over 4 years ago now, actually, it has just been so bad for that company. All he does really is cancel projects that are pretty close to finished, or just get rid of things that they already have. And I know Warner Bros. Was in a bad spot before. It was in a dark place before David Zaslav came in there with the, knight in shining armor, with radiant sunbeams shining on him, potentially being their savior. But this would be like trying to cure alcoholism with heroin. Now, I have no doubt there are some shareholders that do view him as the cure to the disease of money loss that Warner Bros. Was afflicted with. Through his innovative strategy, his remarkable genius scheme of just getting rid of everything, just cutting everything Warner Bros. Has to squeeze some doubloons on the bottom line for the shareholders, it has worked for them, I suppose, at least based on what I can see. But on the grand scheme of things, his strategy has basically just been, hey, you're excited for that? Well, there's a good chance we're just going to can it right before it comes out. Or, hey, we finished this thing that you were excited for, but we decided not to release it because we're just going to go for a tax break on it instead. It's a fucking terrible strategy if you're anyone that likes content. David Zaslav is the opposite of King Midas. He's fucking King ripe ass, because everything he touches turns to ass instead of gold. He's got the cheese touch, and it has infected every part of this company. They are struck with the orb of confusion and can't break out. They just made the baffling decision to shut down Monolith Productions. The studio behind beloved titles like Shadow of War and Shadow of Mordor, with a highly anticipated Wonder Woman game still in the pipeline that, from my understanding, was pretty far along in development. They have now just come out and axed that company. Not just Monolith, they also shut down Player First Games as well as Warner Bros. San Diego. But Monolith is the most surprising one because everyone loves those games. And there's a lot of faith in Monolith as a company. So there was a lot of hype around this game that's been in development for a long time, and now will never see the light of day. Much like a lot of other things Warner Bros. Has done. I've already talked about this a lot. There's no reason to regurgitate it, but I will briefly mention them just refusing to release Coyote vs. Acme even though it's completed. I hate this fucking company, man. It's crazy. But in this case, they didn't complete the project yet. It was still actively in development, and now it won't see the light of day unless it leaks somehow. But what this also means is they're burying the Nemesis system in the coffin with Monolith here. The Nemesis system is one of the most innovative systems we've seen in the last decade. It was a really cool feature that was present in Shadow of War and Shadow of Mordor, and Warner Bros. Patented it, which is why you haven't seen it outside of those two games. And the thought would be that they'd use it in their products because they own the patent, but no. Instead, they crossed their arms and said, it's my toy to not play with. You can't touch it. It's mine to do nothing with. And now that they've killed Monolith, it truly is going to be something that they're going to do nothing with, I imagine. And that patent doesn't expire until 2036. It's so infuriating how dog shit Warner Bros. Is. Like, they're not even doing business, they're doing shitness. Like, I hate to keep bringing up things I've already talked about a lot in regards.
independent Air 1 style to a more dark industrial style, also expanding Mortis to a full band and performance, he made a return to the Air 1 aesthetic in 2020 with Spirit of Rebellion. He credits that return to both a healthier relationship with his early music, and says the exploding interest in genres like Dungeon Synth made him regain interest in the early Mortis identity, the mask, if you will. Even with the revival, Ellefson warns Mortis is always changing, and that will always be true. Now, Burzum. Yes, it's time to talk about Varg. Yes, he killed a guy. Names Varg, Count Grishnak, or just the Count, Varg Vikernes, and, on paper, Louis Cachet, among others, him and Mortis do not like each other for reasons any familiarity with both will make apparent. Vikernes is either the most infamous or famous person to emerge from the Norwegian black metal scene. He ranks as one of the most controversial artists to ever exist, and he makes sure that legacy will persist. Still, while many would prefer the name Varg Vikernes be blacked out from the record, Varg's musical project Burzum's influence is too large to ignore. No matter how taboo many find Varg as a person, a majority of Dungeon Synth artists will acknowledge at least a passing familiarity with Burzum, if not outright enjoying it, or crediting it as an influence. There will not be any psychoanalyzing Varg or his beliefs here, because that has been done to death already, and Burzum as a concept largely resists any attempts to. Burzum is/was technically a band, but beside a few session musicians on early albums, has been Varg alone for its entire existence. In musical philosophy, Burzum reflects Varg's self-styled pagan beliefs, which can best be described as provoking or confrontational. Recording for Burzum albums was one and done. Most songs were done in one take, the first, rarely edited, and performed on whatever was around in the studio. For example, Varg does not remember the instruments he used for most Burzum albums, and would use whatever microphone the studio technician gave him. For Philosophim, 1993, Varg claimed he actually asked for the worst microphone on hand. It was a helicopter headset. While classified as black metal, Philosophim was produced due to Varg's growing dissatisfaction with the Norwegian black metal scene, and the contentious stabbing of Euronymous would follow in 1994. In regards to Dungeon Synth, only 2 Burzum albums need be mentioned beside Philosophim, both produced post-Varg's sentencing in 1994. The pair are often referred to as Varg, or Burzum's prison albums, Daudi Baldur's 1997, Baldur's Death, and Ijjelf, named for Odin's Throne, 1999. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Both inspired by Norse paganism and Varg's own taste in fantasy, produced purely on keyboard because it was the only instrument Varg was allowed in prison. Due to that, the albums took on a synthesized style which was called dark ambient until the advent of the term Dungeon Synth. Post-release in 2009, Varg's music has since alternated between black metal and more synth styles, but his style is most definitely a predecessor of Dungeon Synth. While much can be said on Burzum, little of which has not, the music keeps aglow in the pale of Dungeon Synth. Varg's own unsteady relationship with Dungeon Synth, and a lot of things, is best captured by this quote. I think that Varg, quote, truly does reveal the same spirit which motivates Dungeon Synth, and even H.P. Lovecraft when it comes to the nostalgia for the fantasies in youth. The reeking bog is particularly interesting, since it is obviously negative, and yet is that position he longs to recapture. There are a few other original Dungeon Synth forerunners to acknowledge here as well. Sigurd Wangraven/Saders of the Norwegian black metal band Satiricon's independent project Feldtronen, 1995, another singular example of an early black metal artist striking out into Dungeon Synth territory prior to the advent of the genre label itself. The album is described as Northern Medieval Atmosphere Music by Sader of Satyricon. Sader did brand Feldtronen under the project name Wangraven, but so far, it is the only material he has released under that name and style. Outside Norway, the German duo Depressive Silence has become retrospectively one of the major early Dungeon Synth names with their 2 albums, The Darkened Empires, 1995, and Depressive Silence, 1996. Interesting because Depressive Silence, excellent name, was actually a side project of the duo BS and Rall from the band Mightiest. Time, the internet, and YouTube has made Depressive Silence far more famous and a major cornerstone of Dungeon Synth. It is perhaps the best example of taking a former outlier in older styles and welding it into the Dungeon Synth canon. A mention on obscurity alone is Emglev's Nosveil, 1996, a French band of proto-Dungeon Synth substance. Little background is known on them beside what was printed on the cassette of their release. Discogs has it as, "This demo tape was limited to 6 copies only, for intolerant minds. Concept based on the lugubre atmospheres of Menesarez, while the dead winter." Yes, only 6 copies of this cassette were produced. It now has more than 10,000 views on YouTube. That's a lot of people for only 6 cassettes. That ends the overview of Dungeon Synth's origins in the 1990s, but the 2000s are a sort of dark age for the genre. And not dark age in the good Dungeon Synth way, but in an actual dark age of obscurity. It seems that certain experimental impulse that emerged in black metal moved on to other styles. The exact reasons for why are unclear, but there are a few good theories related to cultural pressure. It is likely the controversies and bludgeonings black metal had taken in the 1990s were having an impact. Artists such as Mortis were drifting to other genres, musicians like Varg were in prison, and others blamed commercialization. People were losing interest in that gloomy synth style. The fact the 2000s in Dungeon Synth are also not well cataloged also makes establishing chronology and influence difficult. Now, that is not to say synths died out completely. Dungeon Synth historian Captain Carbon has a theory related to their idea of Dungeon Synth's origins in the German Kosmisch music. By the 2000s, synth styles were becoming associated with new age music that was vastly, vastly different from black metal. The links are there though. Mortis, for example, credited experimental German bands like Kraftwerk for inspiration. Here's Captain Carbon's theory, but many will reach the same conclusion independently. On a personal note, I even have a working theory that classic Dungeon Synth was a DIY adoption of the fantasy ambient that was created in the 1970s with Kosmisch music, and continued in the 1980s with new age electronic music. As more releases are discovered, Dungeon Synth's history is becoming dotted with records that fit more into the history of electronic music than the birth of black metal. It is very possible the Dungeon Synth impulse, as it can be called, was absorbed by new age, ambient, or electronic styles in the late 90s/2000s. German musicians were expanding massive synthesizer compositions into a commercial direction based on conceptual principles and aesthetics. Groups like the studio duo Cusco were producing thematic, conceptual albums in what would be called today a style akin to Dungeon Synth. The only problem is there is not the technology for independent personal production which made Dungeon Synth popular. This is likely where the missing link of the sparse 2000s rests. Cusco's Apuramak trilogy could each respectively be called Inca Synth, Aztec or Maya Synth, then Lakota/Plain Synth, and fit in on Bandcamp today. There's an entire video on them if you want to deep dive into a mysterious predecessor to Dungeon Synth. Dungeon Synth is very much a genre which is cohering in retrospect. But who set that in motion? It is rare that the true standardization of a genre can be laid at the feet of a single person, or blog. Andrew Wardner's Dungeon Synth blog is the closest one will come to a manifesto for Dungeon Synth. Though, as the writer admits, he was influenced by previous obscure metal blogs like Asmodean Coven, but the Dungeon Synth blog had a unique mission to develop a genre in itself. Inaugurating it with the aforementioned Dungeon Synth post on March 17, 2011, to provide a definition for what was then a loose collection of music descended from black metal. Wordnet largely started the blog to both coin the genre and because he wanted to find more music like it. Looking at the post on the 90s canon from May 2nd, 2017, one can see the composition of the genre laid out in definition. Mortis's Era 1 albums and side projects, Burzum's prison albums, and Wangraven's Feldtronen. Also the Austrian dark ambient band Summoning, which Wordnet mentions as the exception due to their influence on modern ambient music. It is from this definition of the 90s canon core, or the core of Dungeon Synth, that the genre itself proceeded from in style. So where did the term Dungeon Synth, or DS, come from? Well, Andrew, but also Mortis. The earliest issue for the Dungeon Synth blog, before it was even established, was creating a simple name for this composite genre. Andrew thought it should be 2 words like most genres. He developed a term for Mortis's self-owned label, Dark Dungeon Music, or Dark Dungeon Music USA. That is why Mortis is noted as having such a direct influence on Dungeon Synth as a genre. Andrew Wardnet originally wanted to use the term Dark Dungeon Music, or variations, but eventually settled on the term Dungeon Synth due to the production style. 2011 then can be pegged as the year Dungeon Synth started as a named, defined, and cataloged genre, which independent musicians would begin to define themselves within after that 90s canon. The Dungeon Synth blog became the first major hub of Dungeon Synth on the internet until the genre began to branch out between 2013 and 2015. The Dungeon Synth Reddit board would be created on March 8th, 2013, then the Dungeon Synth Archives YouTube channel would be created on November 21st, 2015. Bandcamp would be, and still is, the main venue for Dungeon Synth though. The Dungeon Synth blog would provide a centralization point though. Modern major Dungeon Synth artists like Irong credit the Dungeon Synth blog as the first major pillar of Dungeon Synth as a genre. It allowed a centralized idea and description of the genre to be popularized. As Zero Intern on the Dungeon Synth forum described, Dungeon Synth is very much a genre that manifested and declared independence from other genres. Well, as Dungeon Synth has become diffused into its own culture, the Dungeon Synth blog is no longer as active as it once was. It still posts the occasional review and interview. It serves as a sort of prestige institution and symbol of the heritage for the genre. Andrew Werner is still around too, and his incredible influence in outlining the genre, or maybe carving it out, is acknowledged. So, in retrospect, was there an actual Dungeon Synth tradition that was carried from the 90s through the 2000s to create the Dungeon Synth of the 2010s? There are 3 Dungeon Synth artists to note as sort of bridging that gap between eras, but not directly. Jim Kirkwood is one, but he is also the Dungeon Synth counterfactual, as it were. Jim Kirkwood has been releasing his own, self-described, gothic electronic music since the 1980s, and still does here and there today. That's at least 40 years, and he has released a lot of music over those 40 years. Outside fronting a black metal band in the 1980s, Kirkwood's discography is interesting because it has almost no links to the common accepted sources of Dungeon Synth. He actually predates most of them. Kirkwood is from the UK too, and was influenced by German electronic instead of Norwegian black metal music. As is obvious, Jim Kirkwood's discography is too expansive to analyze in sufficient detail here, but his early work tends towards a fantastic D&D style, and his later work towards more Christian literary themes. His Master of Dragons album, 1991, is considered one of the first major Dungeon Synth classics, but is more electronica than synth. Kirkwood's artistic style is itself now iconic in Dungeon Synth culture too, and is its own major influence on Dungeon Synth music. Lunar Room was a small, pre-Dungeon Synth project which released a few demos back in the mid to late 90s. As one can assume by now, it had links to black metal. Being a side project of Henry Trollhorn Sorvali of both Moonsorrow and Fintroll fame. He is Finnish after all. If anything, Lunar Room is remarkable for being experimental folk ambient Dungeon Synth before the term Dungeon Synth existed. Or maybe it's not even Dungeon Synth. Sorvali is known for being somewhat of a virtuoso in that respect. Lunar Womb is interesting outside its ambient demos like Planets, 1996. After 15 years, Lunar Womb returned in 2015 during the Dungeon Synth revival with a 3rd demo, The Sleeping Green, but also actually not. The Sleeping Green, or Demo 3, was actually a project Sorvali had produced all the way back in 1999. He just kinda forgot about it, artwork and all, on an old computer, and The Sleeping Green did not truly see the light of day until 2015. Who knows what else sleeps on hidden hard drives, like dragons in caves. Another re-emergent Dungeon Synth artist to acknowledge is Cernunnos Woods, if that is how you say it. The project partially shares roots with Mortis. The album, Awaken the Empire of Darkwood, 1996, was released by Cruel Moon International, the international label of cold meat industry which Mortis was signed to. The name makes obvious the very Celtic pagan or Druidic fantasy style of the material. Cernunnos Woods veers towards experimental, with roots in neoclassical, and could be considered a predecessor to Dungeon Synth's more avant-garde wings. It has its admirers and detractors. Then, 20 years later, Cernunnos Woods was revived in 2016 with Forest Anthology, a compilation of Cernunnos Woods demos and obscure works from the 1990s. Not exactly a return as in truly new material, but an effort in collecting material for the genre's chronology. Cernunnos Woods can definitely be placed in the acquired taste recommendations for the already acquired taste of Dungeon Synth. Opinions on the material vary wildly, but it is another branch in the Dungeon Synth family tree that has to be acknowledged. That then closes out the true predecessors to Dungeon Synth. Now, who defines themselves as a modern Dungeon Synth artist?
What?
The largest early name of note was the artist/project Lord Leviticus, or Lord
Okay.
Leviticus, occasionally two people depending. One of the contemporary styles Andrew Wardner considered to have embodied the aesthetics of dungeon synth. Lord Leviticus, who are/is still active to this day, actually came to define their work as dungeon synth due to the
What?
Dungeon Synth blog. Not surprising, as they had listed
Okay.
their major influences as both Burzum and Tolkien. Lord Leviticus's third album is even named Quinta Silmarillion 2010. The important thing to note about them is their material predates the terming of dungeon synth in 2011. Windbuchen was released in 2009, Journey to Beleriand in 2010, the aforementioned Quinta Silmarillion in 2010, Trolldom in 2010, a big hitter in early dungeon synth circles, The Forge's Fire in 2010, Dala Burz Ishi in 2010, and Arcane in 2010. It was a major outpouring of sound before the project directly considered itself to be dungeon synth. Most modern dungeon synth artists, aware or not, are technically downstream from Lord Leviticus's work and influence then due to that output alone. While Lord Leviticus was a major component of the dungeon synth revival, it was not a personality. They admit their material tends towards the composer instead of the performer. The first major personality of modern dungeon synth would be Erong. He is French. Why does he wear the mask? Andrew Wardner credits Erong's Tome 1, 2012, for finally cobbling together the disparate elements of dungeon synth into a cohesive modern vision. Erong's Tome series being a milestone in dungeon synth as a genre, Erong was one of the first who set out to be a dungeon synth artist, to embrace the pure conceptual fantasy of dungeon synth without trying to root his work in any other genre. Erong was after all a reader of the Dungeon Synth blog and highly active in current Dungeon Synth circles. Most of Erong's music is derived from memories and nostalgia, often manifested in his fantasy world or concept of the Land of the Five Seasons, or Land of Five Seasons, a land of magic where all seasons occur at once, and populated by Erong's characters. His image of the land and music is defined by secrets and mysteries which mean something to him, often represented in his music by obscure samples. The man is known to record silence of certain places just to use as backing tracks for his music. Silence. While his roots are conceptually in Dungeon Synth, Erong's Land of the Five Seasons is not tied to Dungeon Synth alone. His 2016 album, Anti-Future, is his style in a retro-futurist 1980s cyberpunk style, or future synth. Erong's often admitted to a heavy influence from both John Carpenter's synthworks and Brian Eno's ambient music, so Anti-Future is more of a send-up to them if anything. He did it again with Endless Realms and Nostalgic Gods in 2018, the Land of the Five Seasons rendered in an American Western sound and style. It's cinematic and even makes some nods at both metal, techno, and even American folk music. Erong, if anything, is flexible. He is well known online, active on YouTube, and if one has ever investigated Dungeon Synth before, they've probably run into his 2 hours of Dungeon Synth and fantasy music by Erong, full albums, video. One of the more major compendiums of Dungeon Synth which got the general public interested in the genre due to YouTube recommendations. Okay, why the mask then? Is it another example of Mortis's long shadow on Dungeon Synth? Well, partially, but also no. Erong is equal parts character and musician. He is interesting because he represents how varied the influences of Dungeon Synth can be. Ultimately, the mask seems to originate due to Erong's early love for bIZAAR Noir, a French punk band from the 1980s who are known for their masks and radical performances both on album and on the stage. bIZAAR Noir is largely unknown on the English internet. One could actually wager Erong is better known to English speakers than bIZAAR Noir, but punk isn't my specialty. bIZAAR Noir was one of the first bands, as Erong admits on his YouTube channel, that showed him how different music could be. Beside the usual Dungeon Synth topics like Lord of the Rings, board games, and metal, Erong also says video games like Zelda 3, The Secret of Mana, and old computer RPGs hold a special place to him and in his music. The Secret of Mana soundtrack especially. Influence from video games and video game OSTs would come to be a defining force in new/modern Dungeon Synth. Erong, for example, says he works on programs that are about 15 years old to make sure he gets that proper sound. Erong takes himself as more of a craftsman rather than artist. King of Nothing, Slave to No One, 2017, is perhaps his sound best distilled down to a single album. It alternates between cinematic, fantastic, and even joyous or playful, a place where Wrong excels in bringing back the daydream fantasies of foreign lands and other worlds. If one is intimidated by the Tome series, which by now has reached about 10 volumes/albums, King of Nothing, Slave to No One is an excellent introduction to Wrong and a sampler for the plethora of what Dungeon Synth can be. The easiest, concise on-ramp to the style. Here's how the man himself describes what Wrong is supposed to be. Wrong is the ghost of the shadows from the past. He wanders through the land of the 5 seasons. He is the magician behind the curtains, knowing what was and what will be. That's why he's wearing the skull mask. Even if my music is often sad and melancholy, I use my memories as a strength to create positive energy. That's what the skull mask illustrates, a laugh in the face of time and death. Wrong, king of nothing and slave to no one. Dungeon Synth best exemplified. There are also a few other foundational albums of modern Dungeon Synth to acknowledge. Both Hedgewizard's More True Than Time Thought, 2014, and Vin Calder's Enchantments of Old Lore, 2015, both are considered modern Dungeon Synth classics. They exemplify the synth fantasy and dark mythology aspects that form Dungeon Synth. More True Than Time Thought is cryptic and haunting, but in the code of English medieval-style synths. Enchantments of Old Lore embraces the sweeping Germanic Nordic aspects and sound, like an expansive icy pine forest gloom. Both obviously draw on Dungeon Synth's 1990s predecessors, but they are more a reformation on that sound rather than a continuation of it. Hedgewizard aims more towards the low-style production and sound, obviously aiming towards Dungeon Synth's origins in lo-fi fantasy, and Vin Calder towards the epic emotions the genre can create in a sort of mythological aspect. Both are good, but Enchantments of Old Lore is probably more accessible due to its simple cinematic and clean sound. In both there is black metal, but it is only faint whispers left. One of the grandest Dungeon Synth epics also has to be mentioned, The Canterbury Tales, 2016 by Chaucerian Myth, not the book. It is considered a modern classic for the genre and a high watermark in Dungeon Synth's development. A 3-hour, 28-minute concept album based on English author Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. The structure of the album in itself is based off the 14th century book of Bawdy Pilgrim's Tales. The album has 25 tracks, with the opening track being dedicated to the book's opening prologue, then the other 24 being based off the respectively titled tales, each track varying in length depending on the respective tale and thematic elements. Canterbury Tales is high concept, but it is long and slow-going even by Dungeon Synth standards, in a good way. Whereas most Dungeon Synth can be enjoyed in the background, the Canterbury Tales album is one that demands the listener's attention. The album uses its form and background in English literature to branch Dungeon Synth out into the wider cultural structure. Chaucerian Myth often has the credit for opening Dungeon Synth up to wider concepts foreign to its origins. So what could such an internet micro-genre like Dungeon Synth become? Inspired by both popular entertainment and myth, Dungeon Synth in the mid-2010s was now coming under far newer and varied influences. The groundwork of synth, black metal, and tabletop fantasy was still there, but Dungeon Synth was becoming mature under its own name and style. The themes of fantasy, nostalgia, and escape were still there as well, but now interacting with things like internet aesthetics, JRPG soundtracks, and connecting with other genres like science fantasy or elements of high art. Anything that offered escapism, aesthetics, or substance could be blended into the concoction of Dungeon Synth. This though meant Dungeon Synth was slowly leaving the dungeon that gave it birth. There was a whole world of shining castles, bejeweled dragons, and singing bards above the dark crypts of that dungeon. New listeners who discovered Dungeon Synth through artists like Lord Leviticus, Wrong, or even Chaucerian Myth, had no background with Andrew Werdna's 90s canon or the artists that inspired the concept of the genre. There was both a culture and genre shift that was bringing Dungeon Synth, in name, to new audiences, as happens with all music eventually. The albums 1 to 5 by Fief represents this development best in modern Dungeon Synth. Fief's albums are still rooted in the fantasy Dungeons & Dragons-esque aesthetics of early Dungeon Synth, but much lighter and happier. Warm colors like sunlight yellows, summer oranges, autumn reds, and sea blues decorate their albums, colors totally foreign to the gloom of classic Dungeon Synth. Their music is more about a sense of adventure on the horizon rather than the gloomy foreboding of a dungeon. Fief, downstream from Erong in a way, focuses on that melody of nostalgia, as it were, but in the mode of a tabletop or video game RPG. Their work has best been described in YouTube comments as save room music, being the gentle calmness in a world of adventure. This has allowed Fief to tap into audiences outside Dungeon Synth. People unfamiliar with the concept see it as a video game OST without the video game, so just an original soundtrack. Fief is both a modern and tasteful entrance to Dungeon Synth as a genre, if one prefers the happier elements.
Switchblade was...
Do not take them as a total departure from Dungeon Synth, though. The lineage is still there. Modern Dungeon Synth artists still regularly tip their hats back to its origins and predecessors in the 1990s/1980s. For example, even if done in other styles, Dungeon Synth albums are still regularly sold/printed on cassettes for sale on Bandcamp. Why is that? It partially has to do with nostalgia and the retro nature of Dungeon Synth in itself. Dungeon Synth label Ancient Meadow Records best explains the tradition in their About Us section. Ancient Meadow Records releases music exclusively on antiquated forms of media, cassette, compact disc, vinyl records, as an affront to the rampant overconsumption and bastardization of independent music by mainstream society. Ancient Meadow Records boasts an ideology and environment of self-sufficiency, do-it-yourself work ethic, fellowship, and admiration for the simplicity of the old ways. Cassette tapes are tangible, warm, and utilitarian. Cassettes bring back the tactile, olfactory, smell your tapes and their inserts, and visual experience of music. Cassettes can be traded for other cassettes, or traded for other tangible goods between friends. Cassettes can be shared. Digitized music lacks all of these wonderful facets of life. And such beliefs are not restricted to Dungeon Synth labels. No one is going to get rich off Dungeon Synth, which gives it a sort of anti-commercial aspect and attraction. Is that not strange for what, in modern form, is essentially a near-pure internet genre? Not really. Dungeon Synth is able to embrace both poles without issue due to being a composer-based genre. A majority of Dungeon Synth artists, or makers, are anonymous or simply go by their screen names. This allows the concept to present itself rather than have someone present the genre or the idea. The popular post-2011 Dungeon Synth artists, who can be called personalities, can be counted on about one hand. Even then, it's often the fictional musical identity that overtakes the personality of the artist behind the mask. It is mostly, if not all, semi-anonymous. All one needs is a computer, a music program, and a Bandcamp or YouTube account. There is no establishment for Dungeon Synth, and it is not yet clear if the genre is even really profitable overall. It is a business or passion of long, complex tracks made at night, usually by people with day jobs or who are in college. The Dungeon Synth Archives channel on YouTube has become one of the central hubs for Dungeon Synth on YouTube. Opened on November 21st, 2015, the archives, thanks to YouTube recommendations, have been one of the main vectors of spread for the genre and had a major hand in its post-2015 popularity, mainly through the ability to bring attention to lesser-known artists' work and more obscure albums from the 1990s. A majority of the people who now like Dungeon Synth and know of it as a genre probably discovered it through the archives. Consider the Dungeon Synth archives to have created the third generation of Dungeon Synth enthusiasts. The first generation came from the Andrew Werdna/the Dungeon Synth blog, the second generation from growth on Bandcamp, then the third from the Dungeon Synth archives on YouTube. With more than 80k subscribers and 15 million views, the channel represents Dungeon Synth breaching the surface of obscurity, as it were. While there is no mainstream on the internet, Dungeon Synth now has a substantial presence on the semi-open web. Proliferation of Dungeon Synth on YouTube has led to an explosion of experimentation and divergences. It seems 2019-2020 may have represented the turning to another new era for Dungeon Synth. The seeds laid in the early 2010s were coming to fruition by the end of the decade. Dungeon Synth was now a genre on its own. Then, suddenly, it was developing subgenres or branches. With a still developing amoeba like Dungeon Synth, it is hard to tell, but post-2019, there are now new lineages branching out from the main tree. This will be a brief review of the tiny mushroom genres popping up out of Dungeon Synth as of recent. The Grandma's Cottage albums, Grandma's Cottage 2019, Grandma's Cottage 2019, Memory Box 2020, and Precious Moments 2021 are largely responsible for producing the subgenre of comfy synth. Comfy, or maybe cozy synth, removes the larger dungeon synth concepts, besides soft storybook fluff, to focus more on the warmth of memories and nostalgia in production. Grandma's Cottage, for example, is supposed to sound like your grandma's house, or an idealized example of a grandma's house. Warm tea in winter, kitschy paintings, and family gatherings. A lo-fi reenactment of childhood nostalgia, maybe even a childhood one has never experienced. As much as dungeon synth is of the crypt, comfy synth is of your grandma's parlor and old rugs. There is sometimes a winter element in it, because snowfall is just cozy, but that is not always so. There are plenty of other elements and settings of comfy synth, but comfy synth is predicated on being smaller than dungeon synth. The Cherry Cordial albums, for example, still retain an element of high fantasy storybook, but are highly influenced by Brian Jake's Redwall novels and other small animal media. As Cherry Cordial's creator Zach Kiernan has described, comfy synth favors major key melodies rather than dungeon synth's minor scale. That gives comfy synth a fuller, more familiar chiming sound like a fairy tale instead of an epic fantasy. A lot of comfy synth has to do with tiny fantasies like storybook mice, gnomes, or cats, but none of that is a requirement. Tootsen's The Safety of Prosperity, 2021, is a marriage between comfy synth, dungeon synth, and medieval or baroque music. It is both ominous as it is cozy or comfy. Both Tootsen and Cherry Cordial show synth painted with brighter colors and whimsy. Both represent what happens when dungeon synth becomes more of a daydream rather than a fantasy. If one wants more, there is even a Comfy Synth Archives in the vein of the Dungeon Synth Archives on YouTube. But is there something bigger than dungeon synth? Bigger and more ancient? Literally coming out of the Lost World, there is Dino Synth. Whereas dungeon synth loves D&D and fantasy, comfy synth loves storybooks and fairy tales, Dino synth loves dinosaurs and movies. Dino synth is the popular image of prehistoric life, dinosaur fiction, and the Lost World, or Land of the Lost media, distilled into a synth genre. Like dungeon synth, it is highly concept-based, but with retro dinosaur growls and old movie sound effects hammered in. It's more ominous than Dungeon Synth 2, with the intention of making the listener feel they are in a world they are much too small for. Maybe it's also a bit too humid and a bit too ancient for them. Duhhlion albums, Slow and Heavy, 2019, both A and B side, and Tales of an Ancient Past, 2020, are the codifiers and popularizers of the Dino-Synth micro subgenre. There's also Slow and Heavy Tyrannic Edition, but that just combines the Slow and Heavy A and B side together with a bonus track. Duhhlion makes one truly feel they are in a Jurassic jungle, maybe filmed on a studio backlot, but it is still incredibly humid and they are hunted by lumbering beasts behind every tree. With tracks named things like Encased in Amber, Return of the Thunder Lizard, and, one of the best, Faint Burning Glimmer in the Mesozoic Sky. One knows what kind of sepia-tone, stop-motion world they are being transported to. Faint Burning Glimmer in the Mesozoic Sky can almost make a person feel bad for the apocalyptic fate that Slow and Heavy's A-side concludes with, as life finds a way. Suddenly, one has just listened to an entire dinosaur concept album without lyrics and only some growling sound effects. How's that feel? Shoutouts to Duhhlion for taking the Dino-Synth aesthetic the entire way. Are there any other exemplars of Dino-Synth? Like Comfy Synth, it is a subgenre of basically a subgenre still awaiting innovators, but there are a few in the field. Synthosaurus's albums are noteworthy, but they have a definite heavy metal sound. Dino-Synth 2 likes to tip its hat back to black metal origins, especially their albums Gigantic Throne 2020 and the Prehistoric Gods 1+2 2020 albums, but Synthosaurus is still Dino-Synth. Whereas Duhhlion is more cinematic and interested in ambience, Synthosaurus is more about the brutality of beasts and the clash of titans. Dinosaur battles, basically. People who like Dungeon Synth may think that it may be a little too much, but those open to metal will like how the songs have a lot fuller sound to enjoy. There's a lot going on in each one. Dino Synth even has a sort of parody, or maybe it's a serious parody? It's pretty good. Neanderthalensis, Short and Stocky, 2020. the title being an obvious play on Diplodocus's slow and heavy. What is it then? Neanderthal synth, basically, or more Neanderthal ambient, evolved to synth tones. Theoretically, one could eventually combine comfy and dino-synth into a cross-genre mixture, something like The Land Before Time. The interesting thing, Grandma's Cottage and Diplodocus are by the same artist. As is usual, besides some Bandcamp information, the artist behind both projects is near anonymous. But both Grandma's Cottage and Diplodocus are associated with the Dungeons Deep label, interesting possible example of cross-pollination between dungeon synth subgenres. Sick of the past, though? What about the future? Science fantasy synth? It does exist. The Knights of Vrol, or Vrol, sorry about the pronunciation, are a little cryptic, but these albums scratch the itch for an adventure among the mystic stars. The cover of Sword of Aeonheart, 2021, should be enough to attract the curious listener. It brings the lo-fi sounds of dungeon synth to space, or more a new genre, while still retaining the lo-fi production style. The track Mirror Moon pushes the boundaries of what dungeon synth is and can be. Knights of Vrol, or Vrol, aim for a mysterious new world, or a kingdom among the stars. Atrium of Time's self-titled album, Atrium of Time, 2022, also deserves attention. Based on American author Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun series/cycle, the album's concept is based around the first book of the series, The Shadow of the Torturer, and it seems the rest will follow if fate will allow. Like the book series, it offers the ominous sounds of a world so close to Earth, but one that is also totally not. Atrium of Time has a sound both blacker than black, Fulgen, and whiter than white, Argent. The Wonders of Earth and Sky is an excellent track to get the taste even if one has no background on Gene Wolfe or the Book of the New Sun source material. Maybe pick up the book while you listen? Dungeon synth is, after all, best enjoyed as ambiance, or perhaps while reading some books of lore. Outside that, here are some miscellaneous but interesting albums that did not fit into any prior category. Witch's Moon, Black Moon Kiss EP, 2017. The first dungeon synth album I ever recall hearing. I probably liked it because it sounded like Halloween and the Dark Cloud 2/Dark Chronicle OST. Witch's Moon as a project seems finished, but Black Moon Kiss is and will always be eerily romantic. Golden Fleece, The Journey to Colchis, 2017. Minimalistic dungeon synth based on Greek mythology, largely the Argonautica. I like it because Jason and the Argonauts, 1963, is one of my favorite movies. Golden Fleece, as of now, looks to be a one-and-done project, but I always come back to this album for its unique sound and sort of metallic nature. Pale, Water Tombs, and Crimson Horizons, 2018. Pale, in general, is one of the best current dungeon synth artists, with a heavy neoclassical orchestral style, basically about aquatic high seas adventures, and who does not want to be a pirate? One cannot deny an album with tracks titled things like Ice Rapiers, Floral Sorcery, and Mist Weaver's Galleon. Umbria, The Entombed Wizard, 2021. Umbria is the current dungeon synth sweetheart, and the title is well-deserved as of recent output. Others have already gushed about The Entombed Wizard elsewhere, but it truly does show the fantastical vein of dungeon synth has not yet been depleted. Once more, enter the Crystal Spire. So, a short introduction, that covers about 30 or 40 years of a genre, which has only existed in name for slightly more than a decade. Dungeon synth is invigorating because anyone can explore it like this. While an effort has been made to outline a canon for the genre, it truly still does not have one. Albums, both new and old, may so soon be bent into the dazzling structure of dungeon synth, the alloy of a new musical experience. What actually is dungeon synth, though? Well, just hop over to Bandcamp and see if you can find out. As Arong says, imagination never fails. Popular in the UK, Scotland, and Japan. This will be important later. They were really only exceptionally popular in the UK and Japan. The only girls in the 1980s music business whose fashion sense and taste of makeup could match the boys of the era, Strawberry Switchblade then, or SSB, requires an introduction for anyone who does not have a nostalgic taste for them, anyone who's not a cult internet fan, or anyone who does not live on an island. The two, Rose McDowell and Jill Bryson, being the mixed product of Glasgow's post-punk scene mixed with the certain dark, new romantic, neo-Victorian fashion sense of the 1980s. Bryson being an art student who had never actually played an instrument before the band, and McDowell, who worked at a cake shop, being an on-again, off-again musician fascinated by punk music and magic. The band's associates would, in retrospect, call their appeal sinister sweet, with maybe an element of sadism, the gothic aspect. Strawberry Switchblade's sound ended up being the definition of 1980s synth-pop, with their defining global hit being the sardonic Since Yesterday. The group existed for an uneven whiplash of 5 to 6 years, made a polka dot on fashion, then was unfortunately relegated by the music press to being one of those "where are they now" one-hit wonders, which they weren't. Bizarrely, Strawberry Switchblade's obituary, the band's, is more interesting than its career. Strawberry Switchblade is one of those groups that is/was more popular abroad rather than at home, though McDowell, as a musician, saw more success as a sort of musician's musician post-Strawberry Switchblade. SSB, though, saw the same sort of pseudo-pop success that the Kelly family saw in Europe, David Hasselhoff saw in Germany, and the Irish girl group the Nolans saw in Japan. Americans do not know who the Kelly family is, David Hasselhoff is David Hasselhoff, and the Nolans, outside Japan, are paradoxically
4, 5, maybe even half a year since I left OTK, and I never really said anything, but I do think I would like to start now. I'm going to go through my entire history of my experience with the org, and then I'll open it up to questions that you guys have. How's that sound? Leaks? Of course, man, of course. I'm the guy who always leaks. Leak the OTK parties? Absolutely. Maybe I should also leak. Never mind. I'm not going to say that. I was about to lie for fun. So let me take you guys all the way back to the beginning on how I joined OTK. So in case you guys don't know, 3.5 years ago, I was one of, not the largest Genshin Impact streamer, but one of the largest channels on Twitch. I'm not going to say who, but OTK was considering a couple of streamers from the Genshin Impact category. However, they thought that I passed the vibe check and that I was actually good to talk to and that I wasn't a fucking loser. So this guy called Rich Campbell started coming into my chat and started talking to me. And I was like, oh, okay, who is this guy? He started telling me that his analytics were low and that he needed to be my editor so he could make ends meet. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on? I look into him, he has a couple followers on Twitch. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'll at least humor the guy. Because, I'll be real. There is a certain nice calmness of mind that comes over me whenever I'm talking to someone who at least gets views. That way I know they're not talking me just to get views. It is a certain, it's like a difference in the world, right? When you have something to gain, I'm a little bit hesitant of talking to who have something to gain from talking to me. Or at least that's how I was back in the day. These days I'm pretty much down to talk to whoever. So Rich and I talked maybe once or twice. We played a game of Among Us, and then all of a sudden, he says, hey man, I want to get into a call. And I say, get me into a call? Okay, sure, let's do it. And I get into a call with Asmongold and Tips and Rich, and I'm not gonna lie, I fanboyed out a little bit. I'll be real. I've been a fan of Asmongold since I was in probably college. I used to play a lot of World of Warcraft. I used to watch his guides on how to be an elitist and how to ninja loot, and some of those videos were things that I implemented into my raid leading and my guild leading experience in World of Warcraft myself. In case you guys don't know, started playing World of Warcraft in the alpha, actually, when I was a wee baby. I didn't really know what I was doing, but my older brothers taught me how to play. Around Burning Crusade, beginning of Wrath of the Lich King, that's when I started to raid lead and guild lead myself, about 11, 12 years old. And I did so consistently all throughout Legion. That's when I stopped playing the game. I did a little bit of BFA, but BFA was pretty shit. I think the last raid I really tried was Mythic Nighthold, and that was a lot of fun. But that's kind of when I said, okay, my tenure of MMOs, I kind of just don't want to play anymore. I'm good. But it was a lot of fun. I got catfished. I raid led. I got told, oh, I had to pretend to be a girl so I could get into a raid, and I was a young kid, so my voice was high enough. And then older men started getting weird because then they thought I was a girl, and it's been a whole history since then. But anyways, yeah, I love Asmongold. yeah, they said they wanted me to invite me out to the OTK 1-year anniversary party. And so I say, holy shit, all right, let's do it. And then I get informed about an org called OTK, and I'll be real, I didn't really know what it was, but because I'm a nice guy, I'm a little bit of a people pleaser back in the day, I was like, oh, OTK, yeah, I know what that is. That's awesome. Super cool. So I get invited out to the OTK 1-year anniversary, and I start meeting a lot of these people. The Mizkiffs, didn't know who he was at all, but I knew that it was important to him that I did. So I pretended that I was like, oh, dude, Miz, huge fan. Great to meet you. Oh, my God. Then I saw Sear. Now, Sear wasn't in OTK yet. Later that day, he actually gets announced to join OTK. But I actually knew him because I used to watch this other creator called Onision when I was a kid, and he was in a couple of Onision's vids, along with a creator called, like, Swift Karate Chop. And I was like, oh, yeah, Sear, bro. I remember seeing you back in the day. You were fucking hilarious. Onision's a little bit weird to talk about these days, but I'm just being real about the story that was going on. Anyways, I started getting swarmed by tons of other creators. The Botez sisters were one of them. Pretty much all of the top streamers were there.
14 months.
Anybody who was a top streamer was there. It was great. I think I met E-Rob there. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm mistaken. I think Emmy was there. No, yeah, Emmy was there. Because I remember the party was going on. I kind of ignored everybody. I'm going to be real. I didn't really want to do anything with anybody because these are a bunch of people who I don't know, and I wasn't really interested in getting to know any of them, to be honest. Besides this one guy who just wouldn't stop talking to me because he heard I was a wrestling fan. And this guy was a sweetheart. This guy was so nice, and he was sitting there playing his guitar, and this guy's name was Jay the Bard. And pretty much it was just me and him sitting, talking about wrestling, talking about anime, talking about World of Warcraft, and I pretty much did that for like 5 to 6 hours. And that's pretty much all I did at this party. I played a little bit of Jenga. I got heat stroke. I almost won like the sports competition, but I got heat stroke. And I was so socially anxious. I got naked by myself in a bathroom and laid on the floor to regulate my body heat because I thought I needed an ambulance. But besides all that, I kind of just went to the OTK 1-year anniversary and chilled out with Jay. Didn't talk to any other streamers. Said hey to Asmongold, say hey to Miz. And then I went back to Canada. Well, then I get into another call, again, with Rich Tips and Asmon. And apparently Jay was really good friends with Asmon. And apparently they liked that I wasn't around trying to talk to every other streamer and network and connect. And they thought that my vibes were immaculate. And they asked me to join OTK. And I said, holy fuck, I'd love to. They also let me know that if I did want to join OTK, I would have to move to Austin, Texas. Now, here's the problem. I had a wife at that time who was bound to Canada. So I had to figure out on how to buy a house in Austin. And I had to figure out how to get my wife at the time down to Austin. And here's what I did. To make sure that I could get her down there, OTK allowed me to let her be employed by the company. I said, I cannot join OTK unless you give my wife a job. So they get her a job at OTK. We get stuck at the border for 3 weeks. And then something worse happens. I have to get a house, right? I had $500,000 in my bank account. Okay? And I was like, all right, I'll put a down payment on a house, but I'm short $300K. And Miz says, oh, you're down money? How much do you need? I say, I don't know, like $300K. And he's like, all right, I'll just lend it to you. I know you got money. I've seen your analytics. I know you give me back, dude. And I say, oh, okay, hell yeah. When do I need to pay this back? He's like, just whenever you're good for it. And I'm like, all right, okay, cool. So Miz lets me borrow $300K. Was great. Was great. I was like, all right, I won't take out a loan because I could have just got a loan and paid for it. But Miz was like, oh no, I got you. So he lends me $300K. And I go, I buy an $800,000 house. My bank account literally goes to about $3-4K, which is pretty much as close to zero as you can get. And I assume that I'm only $300,000 in debt. And I'm like, okay, I owe Miz $300,000. Well, then I get moved down to Texas, and content's going pretty good. I join OTK. I debut on a Thanksgiving stream. I'm like this fucking Grim Reaper guy. Chad had no idea who the fuck I was. I got who megaloled like crazy. But the reason why I was asked to join OTK they wanted me to bring in viewers who actually didn't know me. So them not knowing me was actually exactly what they wanted, as well as my audience not knowing anybody who they were. Because all of my audience said, who Megalol OTK? And all of their audience was like, who Megalol Tectone, right? It was great. But that went really, really, really well. Get settled in. I live in my new place, and then I realize I get hit with two envelopes, and it's from the IRS. And I thought, because I made all of my money in Canada, that I didn't have any taxes. But what I didn't know was that the way that America works is, if you're a resident of America and you make money in another country, not only do you have to pay tax in the country that you made it in, you also still have to pay the tax of Americans. Double tax. Because I had already paid off my tax for Canada, but I did not know I had to pay tax for America as well. And the amount of tax that I owed was $800,000. So I owed $300,000 to Miz, and I owed $800,000 to the government. $1.1 million was I. And so I had an idea. I said, I'll just do a subathon. Okay? I will just merely do a subathon and try to put a big dent into the debt that I owe the government. And then I got told by Miz, he really needs that money back now. So money that I was expecting to pay him back in about a year and a half, I then found out, oh, he wants it back right now. That was really, really, really fucking scary. In my marriage, you guys know how marriage goes, okay? Because people would say, right, and I'm just being real, if you were in a marriage, you usually know this is how it goes. The breadwinner's money is our money, and then the other person's money, well, that's just their money, right? That's the type of marriage that I was in. So I didn't have anybody who was going to help me out pay this $1.1 million. I had nobody to help me with this. I had nobody. The amount of stress that was on me was fucking immense. If you check my analytics, if you check my hours, if you see the sponsors, I shit you not, every single day I was working minimum 18 hours. I shit you not, I was working so hard back then, always streaming, always networking, always making money to get out of debt. I legit lost my hair. I'm not going to lie. You can check the VODs for yourself. That is when I lost my hair. On a combination of COVID, on a combination of overworking. I'll show you this myself. It looks all right, right? It looks all right. But if you check the back, there's nothing here. There's nothing. It used to make me sad. It used to make me sad. But then I realized I lost my hair because when the world was attempting to fuck me over, I said, nah, I'm good. I'm going to win in spite of everything and everybody. Pretty much nobody believed in me. I will be real. I will be real. I mean, the OTK debut absolutely flopped, and I want to make this absolutely clear. I never gained increased viewership from OTK. Absolutely not. The content I make just isn't for that audience. And to be honest, I tried going down that route for a little bit, but I mean this generally. When I tried to appeal to everyone, I was miserable. I wasn't happy. And I think it's very important to say, when you make content for everyone, you're making content for no one. And that's why I really enjoy what I do now. Fast forward a couple years, we're going to come back. I make content based on what I like for the people who like it. To me, my community is everything, and they've always been everything to me. And to be honest, I picked up a couple new viewers from like Asmongold's chat, maybe the Anime Man's chat, a little bit of Trash Days here, a little bit of Soda Pop in there, OnlyFangs, maybe a little bit here and there, maybe like an extra 300, 400 viewers. But if you check my subscribers, they're pretty much 4-year subs or they're 1 or 2 month subs. And that's because I played a game called Limbus Company, and those are all the new viewers. And then all the old frogs are here from like fucking Genshin, Honkai, Arknights, Ulala, Summoner's War. Any gacha game that's ever come out that's worth a damn, I've played it. And if I haven't played it yet, I will eventually get around to playing it. But I was stressed. Let me tell you, when you owe Mizkif money, that shit is fucking stressful. That shit stressed me the fuck out so much. I'm gonna be real. I prioritized paying Miz first over the government because I was tweaking. I was like, damn. Because when that guy, when you owe him money, oh, it's miserable. It's fucking miserable. And even worse, his chat would come in and say, yo, give him his fucking money back nonstop. And I'm like, oh God. Because then I would have to, like, if you can go back to the clips, pretty much anything Miz needed, I would have to do immediately based on who I am. You know, I even went over to his house and shaved his legs. My wife sometimes would go over there off stream and bring him snacks and like clean up a room or two. And it got to a point where I was just like, okay, I just don't want to do this. So I paid him back immediately. I do a subathon. And during this immense amount of stress, I find out that something was happening behind my back. And what that is, it is not the internet's business whatsoever. It is not the internet's business. I don't need anybody to speculate. It doesn't matter. Okay? Don't speculate. Don't think anything. Doesn't matter. Something was happening. And it put a lot of pressure on me. And it stressed me out quite a bit. I had an uncomfortable conversation with a person on a stream that was broadcast to a lot of people during a very uncomfortable, very angry part of my life. And it made the internet fucking hate my ass. Even more so because the Genshin and Arknights were already looking for any reason to shit on me in any way they possibly could. It was terrible. It was absolutely awful because I knew that I was getting shit on for something that was completely justified. But the problem is that this new audience didn't want me because they wanted somebody else to join OTK. And as well as this whole crowd of people where I said, fuck Arknights, I don't feel like dealing with it. Because their community manager was racist towards me and I didn't want to play the fucking game. They're like, oh, okay, now we're going to justify our hatred because look at this guy being a fucking dickhead. Yeah. There's a huge LSF threat on it. Because I wanted to protect people who were very important to me, I make a comment completely owning up to my actions. And I never specified why I did that until a couple of days ago. But to be honest, I kind of just don't want to talk about it. It's a very uncomfortable part of my life. I don't like thinking about it. And yeah, I'd rather just move on, to be honest. I really would rather just move on. But essentially, it became a pattern since then that any way that I could be shit on for anything was taken at every single opportunity. Let's skip forward a little bit, and let's talk about Rich Campbell. Rich Campbell got removed from OTK for some things that I don't even know if he did or not. I have no idea. I've never gotten clarification on that whole ordeal. At first, I was told that he was guilty, and now 2 months ago, I'm being told that he's innocent, and I don't know what the fuck to think. But regardless, Rich got removed. And that was when all of the hatred went OTK wide. That was pretty much the worst thing to happen to OTK ever. Because now OTK was known as that org that has a bunch of sexual assaulters. Yep. Pretty much fucking terrible. And the other problem is that Rich was the punching bag of the org. He was. Rich was the punching bag of the org. Once he left, well, I filled in his shoes. Any butt of the joke was me. Every single fucking time. If there was a shot to be made, it was at me. If there was a joke at someone's expense, it was at me. Every single fucking time. I had one opportunity, or I had two choices. Either play into it or completely destroy my mental health. I said, well, I guess I'll just be the bad guy then. Out of sanctity of my own mental well-being, I said, okay, I will be exactly what they want me to be. I didn't have a name. I didn't have a name for what I was named back then. But fast forward till I meet a person called Bonnie, and she called me Dicktone one time on stream. And one of my own chatters, Plain Noob, who's probably here right now. Plain, are you here? Plain, you're here every stream. Yep. Plain is the guy who made this emote. This was during a Bonnie variety stream. And thus, Dicktone was born. It was either become Dicktone or be a little bitch and cry about every joke that was made at my expense. You guys got to understand. Back when I first joined OTK, I was scared. I was insecure. I had pretty much as charisma as a paper fucking bag. The only way I knew how to be entertaining was by fucking screaming. I had no idea what I was doing. I got into an org way too early, way too quickly. And I was like, okay, this is my role. This is my job. I did a little bit of professional wrestling where I did play a heel by the name of Your Glory, as well as Bojack. And I kind of knew how to be a bad guy. I kind of knew how to be a dickhead. So I said, okay, I'll do what I know. I'll just be a fucking dick nonstop. And a lot of that stuck. A lot of that stuck. And to be honest, I was kind of the heel of the gotcha community already. So it was kind of easy just to kind of play that role. Me just trying to fight to survive. I eventually did that subathon. I got enough to pay Mizgift back. And in that subathon, I think I made around $600,000 to $700,000. I pay Mizgift back. I send all that towards the government, but I still owe them around $300,000. So I just keep grinding, I keep grinding, I keep grinding, I keep grinding. Yeah, the subathon was incredibly successful. And yeah, I kind of lose myself for a while. This was probably around the time there was a content creator called Atsu. And Atsu was essentially making my life a living hell. One of the people I consider my best friends at the time, called Goose Egg, moved in with me. Things were really good. And then Atsu started subtweeting us, saying that we were pieces of shit. Dude goes after my marriage. Other content creators start going after my marriage. Just being full disclosure, before me and my wife got divorced, I had already tried to be separated for about 3 years, multiple times. We both were unhappy, but we were so codependent that we kind of just stayed together because we didn't know really how to live without each other, right? Because we were very reliant for everything. You know, I would provide all of the money, and she would help me with, well, my tech issues. And I didn't know how, I did not know how to stream. I did not know how to stream without her. I'll just be real, okay? I did not know how to stream. I did not know how to go live. It was pretty much, I take care of everything in our lives. You make sure I can press the go live button on stream. I'll just be real. There's a reason in that car clip I say, I do this, I do that, I do this, and then she says, well, I help with the tech issues, because that really was our marriage. I mean, we weren't even having sex, guys. We weren't even having sex. It was literally just, she was kind of like my engineer, and then I would take care of everything. I mean, that's. I mean, you can think whatever you want. That's pretty much what it was. The divorce was going to happen eventually, and it was the best thing to happen to both of us. It was a very good thing. It was a very unhealthy relationship. We still treated each other pretty well, but we had a lot of resentment towards each other. Also, streaming and blowing up on the internet was just a huge toll on our fucking marriage because, you know, obviously, like, you know, you're in a relationship, you're both normal people, then one of y'all starts getting blown up, and, you know, this person's doing really, really, really well, and they become like a figure on the internet, and the other person's like, well, why isn't that me? Right? That caused, like, a lot of issues, but don't worry about that. That's in the fucking past. Who cares? It is what it is, right? It is what it is. Atsu starts making my life a living fucking hell. You know, he gets my roommate to be fucking suicidal. He gets me to be fucking suicidal. My wife is even more miserable than she already is. And, yeah, you know, I attempt suicide twice. Yeah, I mean, this guy made my life such a living hell. And there's so much context on the internet. You guys have already heard it. The only reason why I'm still here today is because, well, when I went to go kill myself, I was in my house in the, you know, in the OTK neighborhood. And I just finished a stream, and it was miserable. And then my vision starts blurring, my head starts going crazy, I start seeing faces on the walls, my body hurts, my heart's going 200 miles an hour. Even thinking about it really fucks me up. I apologize if I cry, I'm a little bitch at times. And I'm gonna go into my bathroom, the bathroom where I went to take the advanced GG bath, where I almost OD'd on caffeine. That was where I was gonna kill myself, was in that bathroom. And then there's Eggy. And Eggy is just such a fucking screamer when he's hungry. And this cat is fucking screaming at me. Where is he? This cat. This cat is just fucking screaming at me. Because when he's hungry, bro yells. Bro yells loud as fuck. Fiji, who the fuck's coming? Yeah, things get a little bit better. Sorry, my memory's hazy. Because whenever I think about that, my memory kind of can just starts jarbling. I might be misordering a couple things here and there. That happened, and I re-grounded myself, and here we are today. I'm alive. Spoiler, I didn't kill myself. Anyways, let's fast forward a little bit. Goose moves out. We all know what happens. Me and my wife finally get our divorce. That was, and I know, I know people are like, oh, it's a divorce. It's so sad. Guys, I promise you, it was such a necessity. It needed to happen. We were both so fucking miserable. It was unfucking believable. It was great. I truly, it doesn't bother me at all. Yeah, we separate, is what it is. I get all my debt paid off. I'm pretty much good. I'm accumulating some income. Jay the Bard recommends me to talk to a new girl. I get into a new relationship with that. Fast forward another year. Ooh. Ooh. Shouldn't have done that. Bro says, yo, I know this chick from VR chat. She's super nice. You should talk to her. And I say, sure. Oh, she is pretty nice. Why'd she go from here to all the way down here? Why does she, how are you like this, and then how do you become that? Over and over again. It was a lot. I didn't really know what to do. I was a guy where I was incredibly codependent on a relationship my entire life, and I pretty much don't know how to function without being in a relationship. I will be completely honest. Since I was 16, the amount of days that I've not been in a relationship is less than 3 months. I truly don't know how to function outside of a relationship. Because I am not a guy who does things for myself. I'm not. I'm a guy where I have to do stuff for someone else. I love making it my purpose in life to take other people's problems and solve them. I love taking other people's grief, absorbing it, and fixing them. So I am naturally more attracted to people who were broken. Because I liked being the one to fix them. I liked providing for them. In my marriage, I paid for everything. Okay? In my old relationships, I paid for everything. Absolutely everything. And guys, don't romanticize that type of idea, because it's not good. If you are in a relationship and you are the sole breadwinner when your other partner can provide, they need to. They need to. Fuck that, dude. I was a simp. I was a loser. Fuck that mentality. It's completely self-destructive. Do not be like me. But that's how I was. Now, I have gotten a lot more respect, and I'm now like, okay, we can both pay for shit. We can both work. We can both help each other. I'm not just going to be the guy who fixes everything. I'm not going to be the guy who solves everything. But that is how I was. It's kind of like on Christmas. I was the guy who loved giving presents. When I got something in return, I was like, ugh, that's weird. I don't like this. But it's been a very unhealthy part of my life. And that's why, you know, in case you guys don't know, a lot of people think that, you know, I've only been in 2 relationships, but since I was 16, I've been in about 9. Now, 7 of those women will tell you that I was the best thing that happened to them. 2 of them, whoa. I'm not going to say which 2, but yeah, either they say I'm gotcha Jesus or they say I'm gotcha Satan. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. I mean, yeah. I mean, it is what it is. We're still like 8 months past the last one, and Jesus Christ. But it is what it is. Yeah. It's just because you don't want them anymore? Well, I'm not going to speculate. And to be honest, I'm really just, I would just like to be left alone at this point. It'd be very nice. But, you know, the last one said a lot of shit. They did. They said a lot of shit. And it was, you know, at the time, it was really bad. But now it's one of the best things that's ever happened to me, because now I realized I was in this org full of OTK, and I saw all these people who were being negatively affected by me because, one person can say one thing about you on the internet, and now all of a sudden